For the n-Lorem Foundation, N of 1 doesn't mean alone because every patient matters. Hope for nano-rare patients and their families has never been more within reach. Visit n-Lorem.org today to donate and make hope possible. Have you heard of the Podcast Awards? It's the longest running awards in podcasting, and the Patient Empowerment Program is hoping to get nominated this year. How can you help us do this? Head over to podcastawards.com. A link is in this episode's description, and click the blue button that says Nominations Voting and fill out your info. Then, now here's a critical step, check off the first box that says, please consider me as one of the listeners that will be randomly selected to vote on the final slate in August. This is key. We need some of you listeners to be in this pool for final voting. Once you submit this, you will immediately have access to the nominations page. Scroll to the education category and select Patient Empowerment Program. While you're there, we also encourage you to nominate DNA Today in the Science and Medicine category. I'm actually the host over there and one of the producers for this show. Then hit Save Nominations at the bottom of the page. That's it. If you have found this podcast at all helpful, this is a quick, easy, and free way for you to say thanks. Even getting nominated would be major for the podcast to be discovered by others like you learning about the nano-rare disease world. And it's the People's Choice Awards after all, so we need you, our people, to support us. So again, please go to podcastawards.com, fill out your info, and select Patient Empowerment Program in the Education category and DNA Today in the Science and Medicine category. Pause the show now, and I promise it takes 60 seconds. Thank you so much on behalf of the entire n-Lorem podcast team.
Hello and welcome to the n-Lorem podcast series, a series that focuses exclusively on patients now referred to as having nano-rare mutations. I'm Stan Crook, and I'm the founder, chairman, and CEO of n-Lorem. n-Lorem is a nonprofit foundation that I initiated in January of 2020. Our mission at n-Lorem is to take advantage of the technology we created at Ionis Pharmaceuticals, Antisense technology, or ASO technology, to discover, develop, and provide experimental ASO treatments to nano-rare patients, and to do that for free for life. Today, we'll be talking about the challenges of treating patients who have mutations in some biochemical machinery called ion channels. And I would say that arguably the most challenging target for which to develop therapeutics are ion channels. Ion channels are complex biochemical machines that reside primarily in the plasma or cell membrane, that is the outer barrier of each of your cells. As the name suggests, ion channels determine what charged particles, remember that those charged particles are called ions, which of those ions can enter your cell and which cannot. And then they regulate what type of ion is allowed at any particular time in the history of that cell. Ions that play critical roles in the lives of cells and you and me include sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, and there are others, of course, but those are the main ones. Ion channels work together to create an electrical field across the plasma membrane. So each of your cells has an outer barrier, and across that barrier, those cells create an electrical field. Every one of your cells has an electrical field at the edge of that cell. Most of your cells then have a negative charge of about 70 millivolts. That means that they're electronegative relative to the outside environment. And so if you put them in a charge, like in a battery, they would move. And you can watch cells move because they are electrically charged. At rest, most of your cells are electronegative relative to the outside of the environment, and they're electronegative by about 70 millivolts. That state is considered polarized. And the other key element of what ion channels do is that they can change the amount of ions coming in and out of a cell at any given time. And they do that all the time. As they change, they can move from a state called polarized, that is charged, to depolarized, that is uncharged. And that way, then they can take an electrical field and create an electrical current. And in fact, I think it's an alternating current. So Tesla and Westinghouse win again versus Edison. The roles that then ion channels play are they create an electrical field and they generate an electric current. The fact that they do that and that we are electrical machines means that they're playing an extraordinarily critical role in essentially all of our organs, including the central nervous system and the heart, for example, where you have to have an electric current being generated at regular schedules, so your heart beats at regular schedules, and skeletal muscles, so you can move your muscles when it's time to move them, and so on. It is, as you might expect, pretty commonplace to have troubles with ion channels. And when you have troubles with ion channels in the heart, you have arrhythmias. And you've probably seen reports in a newspaper of basketball players suddenly dying. What's happened? What's happened there is that they generated an inappropriate electrical current that caused the heart to stop. And the reason they did that is they had a defect in their ion channels. And if you have an ion channel problem in the brain, the most likely first symptom will be epilepsy. Epilepsy is the failure of the brain to generate electrical currents in the way it should, but instead generating a massive flow of electrical current that causes, rather than controlled movement, loss of control, and what we see is epilepsy. It is, as you would expect, problems with ion channels, and we call those channelopathies because we like big words, represent today the most common mutations that we experience in our applications at n-Lorem. We have many patients who have applied for treatment at n-Lorem who have a mutation in one of their ion channels. And since many of our patients are central nervous system patients, almost all of them at the baseline will have some form of epilepsy. And then as a derivative of all that, of course, they have many other central nervous system problems. Key points. Ion channels regulate what charged particles or ions can enter your cells. Second key point. Ion channels are responsible for creating not only an electrical field at the edge of each of your cells, but generating biologically necessary electrical currents. And we are electrical machines. You and I are electrical machines. And without control of the electrical currents that are generated, we have significant problems. Now I want to move on and begin to talk about health, homeostasis, and what I call biological buffering. And this can get a little complex, so just let me take this slowly. And what I want to do in this section is help you understand why ion channels are so challenging to treat. To do that, I need to lay some basic principles down. You know, it's remarkable, really, that health and disease are probably the most used words in medicine. But that traditional definitions of both health and disease I consider completely inadequate. In health, for example, if you look it up, one of the definitions you'll find is an absence of disease. Well, how can something as important as health be defined as the absence of something else? And so I'd like you to consider the definition that I prefer, and that is health is a state or phenotype that allows you to robustly respond to changes in your environment and supports a confident, optimistic outlook on the future. Doesn't that sound healthy to you? Isn't that what we all aspire to be? That is, we are robustly able to take what life gives us and make the best of it, and we can look forward to our future with optimism and confidence. That's health, in my view. If you accept health as that sort of state, then the process of homeostasis is really just the biochemical process that goes on every minute of every day throughout your life to allow you to maintain health. So homeostasis is simply a term that means the effort to maintain a healthy phenotype. Sometimes the body gets confused and thinks that it's trying to maintain a healthy phenotype that's actually very, very sick. That's homeostasis gone wrong. One more definition before we get underway, and that is, in the next little bit, I'm going to refer to gene products. Now remember that we've talked about genes being those elements of the genetic code that cause a protein to be made. But we now know that not just proteins do the work of the body, but also certain RNAs do work independent of being an intermediary to make proteins. And so what I'm going to refer to as a gene product is either a protein or RNA that has a particular function in the cell. Key point, health is a state or phenotype that supports robustly responding to changes in your environment and supports a confident, optimistic outlook for the future. And homeostasis is simply the lifelong effort to retain a healthy phenotype. Now, it is certainly true that many phenotypes can be consistent with what we consider health. You might be 10 pounds overweight and be perfectly healthy, but you might be happier, even more healthy if you lost your 10 pounds. Some days I really wish that for myself. We have a wide range of phenotypes that constitute health. And the reason I think most people can maintain a healthy phenotype throughout their life or until they get sick at the end of their lives is something I call biological buffering. And what this term suggests is that every system in your body has excess capacity. And not only is there excess capacity, but for every critical system that you have in every one of your cells and in all of your organs, you have multiple redundant processes. So not only do you have excess capacity to begin with, you also have built-in systems that will step in and take over for a system that fails. Otherwise, how could we ever possibly stay healthy? And so you can think of us sort of NASA-like. If you think about NASA, the whole goal was to never lose an astronaut. And of course, it didn't succeed, but it succeeded to a remarkable level. And the reason it did was that NASA demanded multiple redundant systems be available. You can see the same thing on airplanes. The reason most airplane travel is the safest form of travel we have today is great effort at redundant systems. And so you are a NASA system. You and I, have all kinds of excess capacity and redundant systems to assure that if one system doesn't do right, another system will step in and do it the right way. Otherwise, how could we possibly stay healthy for so long? It just wouldn't be possible given what a complex machine we are. When I talk about excess capacity, let's just focus on organs. The heart and all other organs in the body begin with great excess capacity. Now, you happen to have just one heart. Many animals have two, but we have one heart with 4 chambers. But each of our hearts has way more muscle present than we actually need on a day-to-day basis. That's why you can have a lot of damage to your heart before you ever end up in what's called congestive heart failure. You have excess heart capacity. If you look at the rest of your organs, you typically have 2 of them. You have 2 eyes. You have 2 nostrils. You have 2 ears. You have 2 kidneys. And you have a giant big liver that can regenerate itself over and over and over again, and so on. Again, redundancy is built in at the organ level. And it's built in most times because you have 2 of every organ. And in fact, that's why most people, if you have a lung surgically removed, you can live a perfectly normal life, even if you continue to smoke for many years. And you can have a kidney removed and lead a normal life, and so on. We have redundancy built in at the organ level. We have redundancy built in at the cell level. We have redundancy built in throughout every system, process, and component of our body. Obviously, if organs have excess capacity and redundancy, the only way that can happen is if at the molecular level, all systems have redundant backups, because we are made up of cells and cells are made up of molecular systems. So you can't have something at the organ level that isn't started at the molecular systems level in the cell. How does that happen? In the first place, we reproduce sexually. And there are many reasons that sexual reproduction is a preferred means of reproduction. And certainly one of them is diversity. You can combine with a male and a female of very different characteristics, and you get a hybrid human being. But another major benefit that I think is too often overlooked is that sexual reproduction results in the fact that every one of your cells has 2 copies of almost every gene. One from your mom, one from your dad. Every cell in your body is contributed to by your mom and your dad. 2 copies of almost every gene. And those copies are called alleles, really just another word for a copy. So every one of your cells, most of the genes in those cells have 2 copies. And it turns out that you can live pretty much normally most of the time if you have only one functional gene. And that's called heterozygous mutations. So homozygous mutations means you've lost both copies. Heterozygous loss of function mutations mean you've lost one copy. You still have 50% of the copies that you started with. What happens in a heterozygous mutation then is every cell is a mosaic. It has a normal gene and a mutated gene. The normal gene makes a normal RNA. The mutated gene makes a mutated RNA. And the mutated RNA makes a mutated protein or mutated RNA that's functional. And the normal makes a normal. And that's the heterozygous state. So a heterozygote simply means that you have chimeric cells. You have cells that have both normal and abnormal RNAs and proteins and genes. Having 2 genes is a really good thing for lots of reasons, but among them is it gives you typically twice as much gene and gene product as you really need to function most of the time. Key point. One important source of redundancy that can be thought of as a part of your biological buffering is simply to have 2 copies of each gene. It's a real boon to be able to be perfectly normal and have one abnormal gene and one normal gene sometimes. If you have an abnormal gene that produces a toxic mutant, that's a very different matter. But if you have an abnormal gene that produces no functional protein or no functional RNA, you can live just fine because you have the extra gene.
Can you believe it's been 2 years since we started this podcast journey together? We want to hear from you on how to make the Patient Empowerment Program podcast series an even better resource for nano-rare patients. Please consider giving us a few minutes of your time to complete a survey on our podcast. As a thank you, you'll receive a special coupon code to the official n-Lorem Foundation store. You can access this survey by using the link in the description. Your feedback means a lot to us.
Join us at the 2024 NanoRare Patient Colloquium, hosted by Biogen on October 30th through 31st in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At this event, n-Lorem will review the Foundation's progress, present case studies, and host discussion panels with members of the NanoRare community. You'll also have the opportunity to connect with supporters, physicians, advocates, and, of course, patients and their families. We hope to see you there. Visit n-Lorem.org to register today.
Another form or source of redundancy or biological buffering stems from the fact that evolution is parsimonious and it's frugal. Parsimonious and frugal, I guess, mean the same thing. When it finds a solution to a particular challenge, it tends to use that solution over and over and over again. And so you end up with derivatives of that solution. And those are called homologs or paralogs. So you begin with a primordial solution, a primordial gene, and then you modify it over evolution, and you may end up with a gene family that has 20, 30, 40 different genes that all have the same basic function to start with, but are modified. That kind of redundancy also provides a real strength in dealing with everyday life, because typically you may have multiple forms of that gene product that can do the same thing. Sometimes the different forms of the gene are expressed in different organs, and that can then lead to specific problems in some organs with some mutations that don't happen in other organs. I realize this is a little complex, but if you just think about the fact that you have all of these processes, NASA-like systems and processes to assure that you can maintain a normal, healthy state. And even in the case where you may have dysfunction in one gene or another, or dysfunction in one system, or lose one organ, you can still be healthy. So you have a lot of excess capacity, and that's called biological buffering. Remember that DNA is transcribed into RNA, and most RNAs have to be extensively processed before they make the encoded gene product. And many of these processing steps actually create different forms of RNA, and they can then create different forms of proteins. And so even at an individual gene level, making an individual RNA level, you still have multiple processes that can lead to redundancy. It's really pretty amazing when you really understand it. So there are many ways that you create the ability to buffer against dysfunction of a gene product. And all of that then allows you to stay healthy. If you go up to the next level after a specific gene or gene product or so on, every one of the gene products that you have is a part of a network. And those networks are stacked on one another, ever more complex in each cell. And then you have networks that connect organs, and then you have that make organs, and then you have networks that connect the organs into the pattern that you see as yourself. All of those provide the redundancy that you need. Often, that means that with an ASO or a drug, we can actually reduce and alter a target a lot before we see a negative effect. That's almost always true, but for ion channels, it's almost never true. And the reason is that ion channels are sort of razor-edged. If you have just the right amount of sodium channels, you have a normal brain function. If you have too little, you have epilepsy. If you have too much, you have epilepsy. Why? Well, because you're making currents that don't work. Either way, if you don't have enough, you get in trouble, and if you have too little, you get in trouble. So ion channels are different from most targets in that there's not a big, broad plateau of activity that will allow you to stay healthy. If we alter the ion channel too much, we can produce epilepsy. If we don't alter it enough, we can produce epilepsy. That makes it tough. That's why ion channels are the toughest, or certainly among the toughest therapeutic targets. That's true irrespective of the tissue, and it's true irrespective of the ion channel, and it's true even if you have multiple ion channels that look similar, because each of those similar ion channels may be managing a different part of the electrical current. And so it's tremendously complex. And that means that if we make a therapeutic, we have to have a therapeutic that we can adjust the dose just right so that you get the exact right amount of sodium channel activity or potassium channel or what have you. And if we overdose or we underdose, we haven't fixed the problem. And that's why it takes a little longer and it's harder to make allele-selective ASOs for ion channels. We have to have great specificity for the mutant. We cannot lower the normal protein at all. Otherwise, we will make epilepsy. And we have to dose at just the right level so that we optimize the amount of that ion crossing the membrane at any given moment so that your electrical currents are normal. And that's real tough. And yet we've been able to do it. And we've been able to do it repeatedly, and we're helping patients with ion channels constantly. But they are certainly among the most challenging targets that we have to deal with. And you can also see it in the amount in the poor quality drugs that are available to treat epilepsy. It's not that there hasn't been an incredible effort to make good epilepsy drugs. There has been decades and decades. It's that it's really hard. And just as it's hard for other drugs, it's hard for us. That's ion channel story. Now, that gets even more challenging when a patient is being treated with other medicines to alter that ion channel at the same time. We have patients, for example, who are taking dilantin, and we have ASOs that alter sodium channels. Dilantin is a sodium channel blocking agent. And so if that patient is being treated with dilantin, as we then increase the dose of ASO, we often, and it's desirable to do this, can reduce the dilantin dose. But matching the dose reduction in dilantin to the increased dose of the ASO is challenging. And so it takes really complex, careful management in the clinical situation to do this right, to help the patient as much as we possibly can. So clinical management, it is challenging. The design of the ASO is challenging. The proof that the ASO is sufficiently selective is challenging. And then developing that ASO that is selective for the mutant allele only is often very challenging as well, because we have a very limited number of ASOs that we can use, and sometimes they may fail in animal studies or whatnot. So it's a tough job. Most of the time, we can succeed. Sometimes we can't. And the worst thing we could do would be to put an ASO into a patient who has a bad epilepsy and make things worse. And so that's why it can take longer for ion channel ASOs, and sometimes it can mean that we just can't succeed at all. Again, it's not for lack of effort. It's not that the science isn't there. It's that the biological characteristics of ion channels make them extremely hard to manage from a therapeutic point of view. Key point, ion channels are more difficult to discover new medicines for than most other targets because they require very high allele selectivity, that is selectivity for the mutant RNA and protein only. And even if we get that, matching the dose to the needs of the patient can be very challenging in the clinic, and it will take time and effort and good clinical management to get that job done well. So ion channels create lots of problems, and we are addressing those problems, and we are making patients better who have severe ion channel problems. But I want you to understand how challenging that task is for us and how challenging it is for our clinicians who are taking care of such patients to manage all of the drugs those patients need and do it in a way that optimizes care and makes them as healthy as possible.
n-Lorem is a nonprofit committed to discovering and providing personalized experimental treatments for free, for life, to patients with genetic diseases that affect 1 to 30 patients worldwide, referred to by n-Lorem as nano-rare. Many of these patients progress and die without ever achieving a diagnosis. This is where n-Lorem comes in. They do the impossible by providing hope, and for those that they can help, free lifetime treatment. For more information about n-Lorem or today's episode, visit n-Lorem.org. Any questions can be sent into podcast@n-Lorem.org. Search n-Lorem on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook to connect with us. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allows others to find the show. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Stan Crook. Our videographer is John Magnuson of Mighty One Productions. Our producers are John Magnuson and Kira Deneen of DNA Today. Thank you for listening.